So hello everybody, this is the webinar on how banks can speed products to market through systematic selection and approval of cloud services. Now what would that be? So first a little bit about me. I am one of the world's most experienced independent cloud trainers, and I've delivered cloud training to hundreds of students. I've seen a lot of business cases and situations of companies. I'm a certified trainer for the Cloud Security Alliance CCSK, and some of you have been through that. 28 units and counting. I will have a couple more in the next couple of weeks. I wrote the Cloud Business Essentials course that I'm expanding at this time. I also wrote Professional Cloud Technology Associate, which is run by the Cloud Credential Council. And I was author of the original CompTIA Cloud Essentials training, which was the first vendor-neutral certified cloud training. I've worked across the board at university, service provider, consulting, so I've seen quite a number of sides of the industry. Currently I'm also a board member of the Dutch Cloud Security Alliance chapter. So what I'm going to do is I want to lead you through my 8-step cloud adoption roadmap. And interspersed with that, I have put in a number of things. I've put in a recent report that the Cloud Security Alliance has produced, which is very interesting. It has a global footprint, so banks from around the world were included, and the input was from fairly senior level officials there. Secondary, I have a cloud business case from an insurance company. And I have added in some other experiences that my customers have and that I find by additional desk research. And then we'll end by what the next steps are that you would be able to do. So first, a brief note about this report. As you can see, this is a pretty new report by the Cloud Security Alliance. It's about a 20-30 page PDF, which you can download for free. You just have to search for the title, and then you'll probably find it really quickly. So the roadmap. The number one step in the roadmap, as far as I'm concerned, and this is borne out by my experience, is that you have to be clear on what you want to do with cloud, either as a consumer, as a provider, as whatever. You want to know why you want to do this, or why your customers want to do this if you are a cloud provider. Failure to answer this question will lead to trouble and problem and stagnation later on in your process. Well, there's 3 levels of business benefit that I typically distinguish. The first basic level is cost saving. Actually, that's the most uninteresting benefit of cloud. Obviously, you can save money by going to the cloud, but that does not change your business. It does not give you any new business agility. The whole business agility promise of cloud computing is much more relevant for the overall cost of the business. I mean, you can save a few percent on IT, but that does not make any significant difference in the larger scheme of things. If you make a couple of percentage points difference on the business, that's much larger. And if you can use cloud to go to places where your competition is not going, now then we're talking. Of course, everybody can have their own favorite reason for going to the cloud. Now, what did the Cloud Security Alliance report find out? Well, here's a diagram that says, well, it's the primary reason for adopting cloud computing, and the top 2 actually are not about cost. They are about being more flexible, more agile, reducing time for provisioning. Of course, the third one is reduction in total cost of ownership, but all the others, or most of the others, are really not about cost. Now, another interesting thing that pops up in the report is that banks that have more digital customers, like that do banking on the web or on mobile, are less likely to have a no cloud strategy. It's a bit of a double negative. So the idea is that the more digital customers you have, the more likely you have to have a cloud strategy. And if you have fewer digital customers, like more traditional, then you're likely to have a no cloud strategy. Additional reasons in the financial industry for going to cloud would be like that. So companies that provide accounting software, they are definitely going cloud. And what I also see in my training is that people report pressure from line of business and external suppliers to say, well, cloud's the way to go. You know, we as a bank, we need to go that direction. Now, the example that I have is arguably not from a bank, but from an insurance company, but rest assured they have the same regulatory pressure. So this situation is actually a pretty interesting one, and not really that straightforward. So the situation of it's a life insurance company. They need to comply with what's called the Solvency II regulation, and that requires that they report on the net present value estimate of their entire life policy portfolio, which is millions of policies over thousands of scenarios. The way they do that is to crunch that portfolio with a couple of hundred CPUs for several weeks, and they have to do that every quarter. When they started out in this project, they were doing this in their own data center. Now, why would they want to go to cloud? Well, they figured out we need more flexibility and capacity in terms of different scenarios, presumably, better disaster recovery. They were doing it in their own data center, but they were having some issues with the long-term viability of that approach. They were lacking a little bit the skills to size the machines and the software. In terms of assurance, it wasn't too good. As you can imagine, if you run that kind of workload in a data center, that's not easy to migrate. And they needed quicker changes in that. And the process was now taking 6 weeks. And at the end of this project, they managed to cut that down to 2 weeks. Now let's see how they actually did that. But first to number 2 in my roadmap, which is why not? What's holding you back? What are the stumbling blocks that you see in your cloud adoption strategy? Now we will be talking about banks here as cloud consumers, but the same steps also hold for other companies like cloud providers or cloud brokers or what have you. Now let's look at the CSA research study. And again, I'm not going to read all the details here. If you're interested, download it and you'll find out yourself. So the top concerns are not that surprising. They are confidentiality of data, control over data, and legal and compliance issues. In this top list, the lower side is made up by availability and provider lock-in. That is, in the grander scheme of things, not the lowest concern, but it's maybe surprising that this doesn't get that much attention. Additionally, outside of the CSA survey, the anecdotal evidence suggests that uncontrolled cloud adoption by lines of business is really endemic in banks and financial organizations. I mean, this is done outside of the IT department. Now, there are people, especially in the IT department and at the risk managers, that are somewhat worried about this. So that definitely counts as a why not question, why we shouldn't be doing cloud. Okay, back to our example, our running example. The insurance company was mainly worrying about, okay, regulatory and compliance concerns. I mean, those are fairly obvious. Can we do this? Are we allowed to do that? But separately, we also hear them say that they worry about the competence of doing this stuff themselves. They were doing it themselves in the data center, but not in a cloud fashion. They were having dedicated hardware for that. And they wanted more flexibility, but they worried about having the competence around that. Now, the third step in my roadmap, once you know why you want to do this and why and the obstacles that you see, is to devise some kind of process to figure out how would you want to approach your cloud adoption, either again as a provider or as a consumer. And in our cases, we're talking about consumers. Who do you involve? What kind of stuff is there that you can leverage, etc., etc. And it really depends. If you want to design greenfield a new application, then the process is very different from the one that you have if you have a couple of hundred onboarded applications that you need to, let's say, get assurance on. The CSA report finds that most organizations do not even have, most financial organizations do not have a concerted cloud migration strategy at all. So there's definitely room for improvement there. It is hodgepodge spread across the organization. Now, in terms of strategy, the industry regulation is driving this, and one reason to respond in a concerted way is that financial institutions in particular are required to implement specific security measures. Evidence from other sources indicates that, on the process perspective, that most banks and other financial institutions actually do have compliance processes. Obviously, I mean, they've been doing IT for decades already, and they have had compliance issues for decades already. And what they're seeing is that they oftentimes can adapt compliance processes that they have from pre-cloud situations and adapt them to cloud. In general, though, there are significant issues around that, and it's a struggle to realign the scope of these processes. They go by the name of External Connections Committee, and it's typically also fairly embedded in change management in general. Auditors will look after every change if you are still capable of resolving incidents, and if availability is not hurt. So those processes exist, but the processes are not necessarily adapted to cloud or staffed by people that have the appropriate cloud skills and insights. Our insurance company example was in project mode, more or less, and what they did was to assemble a cross-functional team to guide the process, which is really an outsourcing process. So they pulled together the stakeholders, the business unit that actually was responsible for this Solvency II report, business information manager, so it's the account manager from the IT department towards that business unit, service manager, procurement, contract managers, risk managers, security managers, legal, all into that project team. And their project plan had a number of steps that I won't go into detail here. But the project plan ended in a go-no-go decision and a step to inform the regulator about their outsourcing decision, which is required in this particular jurisdiction. Now, the fourth step in any cloud strategy, cloud adoption process is to figure out, okay, what are we exactly going to deliver to whom? Who are the consumers? And what is the service that they will be getting from the cloud provider? Now, this particular second bullet is phrased from the perspective of a provider or broker, but you can turn this around also. Typically, however, the IT department is not a consumer, well, it is a consumer of cloud services, but it's not the end consumer of cloud services. They are providing a service and brokering a service to business units. Now let's have a look what kind of applications are being adopted in a corporate bank context according to the CSA survey. Interestingly, the top two actually are the usual suspects, I would say. Customer relationship management and application development. Now, application development actually matches our agility objective fairly well, but CRM, yeah, it does the same, but not from the business perspective, not from the IT perspective. Now, the rest you can look over that list, and it reads like a shopping list for IT applications for basically any company. The most noticeable exception in this particular list is core banking itself. Now, I would say that's not really surprising, because core banking in its, well, as I said, in its core isn't really changing a lot. So there's not much of a change driver in core banking. It's the same, the way we run the basic banking services hasn't changed drastically over the past couple of years, and is not likely to do so either. It's the stuff around it that is changing all the time, and then tweaking the processes around it. Some examples, because this list is fairly, straightforward and very generic as well. I mean, you can't even tell from this list that it's bank specific. Now, if we look at the anecdotal evidence that we get in, talking to people, they say, well, we're getting a lot of data feeds by the cloud now, that used to be sent in by CDs or whatever. They're connected through the cloud now. So that's incoming data feeds. It's like the Bloomberg terminals, but then on a much more extensive scale. And other stuff like credit ranking of customers, businesses, what have you. And there's also a significant amount of, apparently, a significant amount of outsourcing of analytics, like investment portfolio analysis. A lot of customer interaction is being put in cloud solutions. So these are the types of services that are relevant in a bank and financial industry context in general. Now, our specific example, the private cloud insurance company, really wanted to have substantially more flexible and scalable solvency reporting. Well, actually, solvency analysis and reporting. And long term, they also wanted to be more sure of the compliance of that process. Because basically, if that process is not working for a couple of months, or it fails, and you have a 6-week batch, the batch fails in its 5th week, you have to run it again, and it fails again, you're 1 quarter short. And the fines that you get from the regulators from not reporting your NPV are fairly significant, and they will constitute a career limiting move for some officials of the insurance company. So basically they wanted what they had from a functional perspective, but they wanted it to be much more flexible and scalable. Now on towards our 5th step of the roadmap, and that is, which partners and providers are we using to get that service? It does not make much sense to do this step before we have answered the questions that the previous 4 steps have raised. And because, well, if you don't know what these guys are delivering, or if you don't know what you want, then it doesn't matter, then you can't ask the question. So turning to your technology suppliers or upstream cloud providers to think of, okay, what shall we do, is begging the question. I mean, of course, it makes sense to talk to these people and get inspiration, but you decide, and then you talk to them. So how does that work in a banking context? There is not a lot of data in the report, but in the CSA survey. But one thing that's there is the features that the banks desire from cloud providers. And the number 1 feature is help me be compliant by being transparent and giving controls that I need to be compliant. The second thing is that in terms of the partners and providers, banks are expecting to be working on the basis of a hybrid cloud strategy. There's no way that they're going to do all their IT fully in the cloud as of now. And so there will be a mix. Now, one reason why this would be is, of course, the legacy that they have. Arguably, if you would start a bank from scratch, you could potentially outsource all your IT to a bank-in-the-box provider. And allegedly, there are a number of companies worldwide that are realizing those platforms or have already done so to some extent. So if you are not very agile as a bank, you better start thinking, because there will be banks that do not have any big assets in IT themselves, because they will be able to outsource all of that. Again, how was our example company, insurance company, doing that? Well, they worked with two major providers, and one of them was the external private cloud provider that more or less was going to function as a managed services provider, but internally there was definitely a very specific private cloud discernible. And the other relevant partner that they had was a Big Four audit firm for assurance on their entire setup. Okay, that's step 5. Now once you have figured out who you're going to work with, and then you know what you have to do yourself, because that's the delta between what you want and what somebody else is delivering to you. Then comes step 6, as I have identified in all the work that I've been doing, which is attitude and skills. This is even more important than processes, because I think if you have the right attitude and skill set, then the process will develop itself and not the other way around. So that's step number 6, and how does that, how do we substantiate that? The CSA survey doesn't have any specific findings on that, but I can tell you what I see happening in the practice. I see banks and insurance companies are scaling up, so to say. I think in the region that I work with, most banks have actually come to my training, and sometimes they send entire teams cross-functional to cloud security training, and those are really the interesting trainings because you can discuss their entire risk management process around cloud with them, and that really makes a difference for those teams. The teams will be very much more agile, and all the conflict that they used to have internally, which was stalling progress, was sort of reduced to a large extent, which really speeds up their development and decision processes. Now in our example company, I didn't get that much detail, but the number one thing was of course to have a cross-functional procurement team, and that to bring together all the skills that they needed to do what they wanted to do. And some of those skills were outsourced to either the managed hosting provider, the private cloud provider, as well as the audit firm. Now once we have this, we can start building, get the structure and the technology right. Part of that, and you know, if you would run a course with me on this, we could talk for a significant amount of time on how this actually looks like if you have a real cloud environment, and it depends on the service model and the deployment model that you use. But this is the phase where you design your technical architecture, including all more detailed security processes around this, as I will demonstrate to you. What CSA is finding is that, again, it's a bit of it's reminiscent of what we've found earlier, that the banks are using a hybrid cloud strategy. Well, I would say the banks are finding themselves using a hybrid cloud strategy because they don't have a formal strategy a lot of the times. What's also very obvious from the findings is that one of their number one technical controls is encryption and tokenization of data. That's a little less trivial than it sounds to begin with, because that's at places you will have to rethink entire processes. It's not entirely, well, and as an example of an initiative that was going around, it's not specific to banks, but it does show you how invasive these controls can be, is that MasterCard and Visa are proposing a scheme where merchants would no longer store credit card numbers for their clients, but instead they would store tokens for those credit cards, tokens that would be specific to a merchant. That requires a total overhaul of a significant amount of IT systems, but it has a very big benefit. If you are able to do that, that means that even if you steal the entire database of a specific merchant, it will be totally useless, because that database will only be meaningful, those tokens will only be meaningful when run from that specific merchant. So that's an example of how some of those controls can be very hard to implement, while at the same time being extremely relevant. Now, blanket encryption of data, etc., is, almost that can be fairly straightforward. We actually have a exercise on the CCSK training where we'll spend about like 20 minutes doing that. Other observations, again from other clients and people that I talk to, is that procurement and risk management processes are slowly being adapted to cloud. It's hard because the people that are involved in them don't necessarily have a great cloud insight. How's cloud different? It's different from traditional outsourcing. It's different from doing it yourself. There are challenges in adapting operational processes. The help desk would say, well, either it's one of our applications, so we worry, or it's not one of our applications, and then we don't worry. That doesn't work out very well. For one example I had from a banking customer, I said, well, we have something like an approved list of external cloud providers. Think, Box, or I think they were even using WhatsApp as an approved cloud provider for specific functionality. Now somebody needs to tell the IT service desk that you can actually do that. So this is a simple example. And finally, what we see is that lines of businesses procure SaaS generally, and the IT departments are generally positioning themselves as an infrastructure provider or as a broker. That does not mean that this is the best or most successful strategy, but this is what we see happening. And if you are concerned as to what would be the best strategy for this, well, let's talk. Again, back to our example company. Actually, I'm not making this up. This is real stuff. So they outsourced basically all their technology, most of their technology, to the external private cloud provider. And they were running their analysis in what we should call a private infrastructure cloud, where in this particular case they had an entire virtual machine zone, or an entire zone of that private cloud dedicated to the customer. So they could actually say, well, here are your racks. We have physical hardware in these racks. We run a ton of virtual machines on those, but these racks are all yours. And now when the batch would be done in a week or two, they would say, okay, we're going to re-image all those physical machines and we'll put it back to a different usage. The external private cloud provider would be responsible for sizing, which means that actually they are as I said, they're a managed hosting provider. So in a way, they're more like a PaaS or SaaS provider. But internally, they were using this private infrastructure as a service set of racks. Then the private cloud provider was also responsible for installing the software. Around that, they did data masking on export and import. You can understand that if you need to calculate the value of a portfolio of policies, you don't need all the data that's in those policies. You probably need the ages and sex and other stuff of the people, but you don't have to have their names or addresses or any other, or payment information or what have you. And this is a generic theme with cloud. Data moves around in the cloud, and at every point where you hand it over to another, let's say, control authority, you need to be very aware of the filtering that you can apply to avoid data leaking out too much. So that was a technical / logical control that was part of the structure of the solution. And then we get to our final step 8, where we consolidate and secure our success, so to say. Of course, all the governance and risk management that goes into an entire solution, this has to start earlier on. You have to think about this earlier on, but I've used step 8 to rethink this. And getting back to our example, to the survey, we'll see that here's a couple of controls and ways that banks approach compliance assurance. So they make specific contracts, they make SLAs, or at least look at them in a lot of detail. They may do audits, and they use the CSA cloud controls metrics. And that is actually borne out by the stories that I hear from the companies that I talk to. It's becoming a very common practice to slap the cake, the Common Assessment Initiative questionnaire, which is based on the CCM, to slap that onto a provider and then ask questions. Providers are reluctant at first, but once they understand that the entire world is going to do that, they actually see benefit in that. And that becomes a good structure for the discussion that they can have between the provider and the bank. And I've seen that, I've heard that report by a number of my customers. Final observation here is that the Dutch Bank Authority has a cloud risk management approach that closely follows the ENISA cloud assessment. And together a NISA document and the CSA Cloud Controls Guidance document, they are the CCSK body of knowledge. And that is the basis for, that's the most well-recognized vendor-neutral cloud security individual certification. But there's more on that later. Now, in our company, our example company, how did they secure the success of this? Well, they're an external audit firm produced a SOC 2 compliance statement. Now SOC 2, again, there's a lot of material there on the web. SOC 2 is probably one of the most stringent compliance frameworks for service organizations. That's what it stands for, service organization controls or compliance. And the 2 means that you actually demonstrate that all the controls work on a continuous basis. And some of the stuff that they did is not uncommon in the cloud world, but it is pretty new for a lot of organizations. For example, automation of evidence collection. In all your processes, you make sure that you record any decisions that were made by people, that you log like identity and access information. You embed certain controls in the workflow, like 4 ICE principles. There's stuff that needs to be done in contracts. There's a right to audit that you want to make sure that you have, or at least that you have enough right to audit. And finally, in our example case, they had a specific provision for what's called the what somebody else is calling liberation of data. So for this particular service, there were virtual machine images prepared that are custom made for the insurance company under the control of the private cloud provider. And in the contract, they basically said, okay, we want those machine images to be available to us outside of your influence at all times or at regular intervals, whatever. So that's the way that this particular company did that. Now, in summary, back to the roadmap. Here's the 8 steps again. First question, why do you want to do this? Because if you don't know why you're going to do this, you will soon run off the tracks. You have to be clear why not. If you're not clear, then somebody else will later on in the process, start sabotaging the entire process. Then if you know why and why not, you can start defining a process for adoption, and it could be fairly simple, especially if you have non-critical cloud solutions, but it can be fairly extensive. Now, what to whom is a step that follows from there, where you define the services that you would require to get the benefit that you've identified in step 1 while avoiding the risks that you have identified in step 2. And then once you know what you want, you can actually go out and try and build it with external partners and providers. in general, I think in the future we will see a cloud-first strategy in general, but you have to be open to the situation where you cannot find a provider that will deliver the software that you want. So there will be some intermediate gap that you need to cover, and that intermediate gap, and there always will be some adaptation to your own business, needs to be filled with the right people and with the right skills. And if compliance is anywhere relevant, you need to have some kind of compliance culture, because otherwise it's gonna be a disaster. Given that, you can then ask these people to figure out the structure and the technology of your new IT landscape. And once you have that pieced together in some level of detail, you can revisit all the steps that you were working on to secure the success. And maybe when you've reached that, it's time to revisit your original ambition and say, well, why cloud? And you might say, why not? We should be doing more cloud. And you might think of new opportunities once you have your battle experience in this. So that's the roadmap summary. I'm going to open up for a few questions right now, and then we'll discuss what could be next steps for your specific situation. I think the question that you could ask yourself or ask maybe even your customers or your providers is, okay, how developed is your cloud strategy, and how developed is your cloud security strategy? Is it is it easy to speed along the roadmap towards optimal benefit of cloud while keeping an eye on risks? Are you applying some kind of roadmap? Are you fully aware of security issues? And then what I see a lot of companies do is basically being overly scared of security. That's not good either, because that's costing you a lot of money without having the appropriate and relevant benefit from that. So once you have that question in your mind and pondered it for a bit, I give you the suggestion to benefit from a review of it. You can have it reviewed by, for example, by talking to me. Reach out if you have a specific issue there. You will find my email address there. If you have a more specific option, or if you have a more specific opportunity for getting ready for your individual cloud security certification, the CCSK, then just drop your name and email address into the website www.ccsk.eu, and you will regularly be informed of training opportunities either in real life classrooms or virtual, as we've started to develop them right now.